Mr. Speaker, it is indeed an honor to speak in the House today regarding this Bill C-22. Mr. Speaker, this last weekend, the Prime Minister, while speaking to the Liberal Party Policy Convention, said that the Conservative Party of Canada was disconnected with Canadians. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister is looking for an example of a party being disconnected with Canadians, he need look no further than his own party with the introduction of this Bill C-22 and how it affects those in rural Canada. As someone who has lived my whole life in northern Saskatchewan, I not only find this bill dangerously naive, but the government's communications around it are actually offensive to me. Of course, Mr. Speaker, far be it for me to suggest that anyone might deliberately mislead Canadians. Perhaps it is simply poor understanding of the criminal code or the tendency to rely on divisive political ideology that led to the inaccuracies in communicating what's actually in this bill. Contrary to what members of the Liberal Party may have been given as talking points by PMO to use in the debate, those of us who actually read the legislation understand that this is not about reducing mandatory minimum penalties for simple possession of drugs. Mandatory minimums for simple possession do not exist today. This was not about minor crimes and is not about minor offenses. Mr. Speaker, here are just a few examples of what Liberals consider minor offenses for which Bill C-22 eliminates mandatory minimums as they relate to gun crimes. Robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, weapons trafficking, importing or exporting knowing a firearm is unauthorized, discharging a firearm with intent, using a firearm in the commission of an offense, possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, possession of a weapon obtained by the commission of an offense, possession for the purposes of weapons trafficking, and discharging a firearm with recklessness. Additionally, Bill C-22 would eliminate mandatory minimums under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act that actually target drug dealers. Examples of these are trafficking or possession for the purpose of trafficking, importing and exporting or possession for the purpose of exporting, and the production of substances Schedule 1 or 2. And examples of these, Mr. Speaker, are heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, and crystal meth. This is not, as suggested, help for those who struggle with addictions, but it's actually help for those criminals who prey on those people who suffer from addictions. Finally, this bill allows for greater use of conditional sentence orders for a number of offenses. The list is long, so I will include only a few examples. Sexual assault, kidnapping, assault causing bodily harm or with a weapon. And Mr. Speaker, this includes the assaulting of a peace officer causing bodily harm or with a weapon. Mr. Speaker, this clearly puts communities in my riding at risk. As a lifelong resident of northern Saskatchewan, a hockey coach, a former mayor, and now a member of parliament, I have seen firsthand how gun and gang violence and drugs ruin people's lives and devastate families and communities. I find myself wondering if members of the Liberal government were contacted by mayors, chiefs, police officers, and community members like I am, pleading for something to be done, if they would realize that Bill C-22 is not a solution. And Mr. Speaker, neither is Bill C-21. Mr. Speaker, 1 month ago, there was a story reported in the Battleford's Regional News Optimist that literally brought me to tears when I read it. And I would encourage all members of this House to read the story, as it provides an incredible insight into what life can be like in northern and often remote communities in my riding. The story reviews a judge's decision, arguments by the Crown prosecutor, and the victim impact statements of RCMP officers Robert McCready and of my good friend Staff Sergeant Ryan Howe. The incident, as reported, as I said, happened in my riding and shows an almost unbelievably violent disregard for human life. It includes multiple guns, pursuits, many other things, and finally, police ramming a vehicle. In his victim impact statement, my friend Staff Sergeant Ryan Howe said the following, and I quote, "When I encountered the gold truck you were in, north of Loon Lake, the only emotion I felt was sadness. I knew right away how this was going to end. It's always the same, just a varying degree of tragedy. When I saw your co-accused run from the Equinox and point what may have been a gun at me, I just felt tired and defeated. I knew what you would do when you came up to that roadblock, and you did the same thing every other desperate criminal does. You accelerated and swerved towards the police. As you did that, I took off my seatbelt and accelerated my truck directly at you. I wanted to be able to at least have a chance to maneuver in the cab if you and your fellow gang members started shooting at me. As I lined up my truck to yours head on, I fully expected to be shot, but I tried to make sure my truck would stay on a straight path and hit you, even if I couldn't steer because you needed to be stopped. Even after all of this, after hours of chasing you, hours of being frustrated, angry, and tired, I was required to be of calm mind and use sound tactics as I drew my gun on you and the other people with you. At that moment, I was furious that it had come to this. I was furious that your stupidity was causing me to miss an important family event going on right at that very moment. I had you in my gun sights. I was furious that I might have to shoot and kill you. I didn't shoot you. My coworkers didn't shoot you, even though we were taunted and dared to do it by the people in the truck with you. Even though your actions caused one of my coworkers to almost be run over and killed, we made sure you were safe. It was a joke and a game to you. It was life and death for me, for my partners, and the public. I'm telling you that on January 17th, 2019, you were lucky to be arrested by some of the most capable and experienced police officers in the country. They showed incredible restraint, professionalism to make sure you lived to be here today. Another one of those capable and experienced police officers was Officer Robert McCready, who was called in 6 hours before his shift was scheduled to begin. A short part of his victim impact statement includes the following, and I quote again. I had been in Loon Lake for a while at the time and had a feeling that it was probably related to gang activity, firearms, or both. I got geared up and I found that gang members and affiliates have possible firearms and are driving in 2 vehicles and are evading police. My thoughts are, great, here we go again. This was a constant way of life around that area. Something would pop off at least once to twice a week or more. This went on all afternoon, which took a bad turn when the vehicle started going through a populated area just as school was letting off. And for fear of worsening conditions, police had to back off again. Mr. Speaker, in speaking with Staff Sergeant Howe later, he shared with me how these events had become almost routine. Can you imagine this being a routine part of your day, Mr. Speaker? This is the part that brought tears to my eyes as I fought back the emotion. Now, let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, this day was the culmination of a long history, but it had to start somewhere. The idea that government is seeking to eliminate mandatory prison time for drug traffickers and for those who commit violent crimes is really hard to fathom for me. Allowing criminals who commit violent acts to serve their sentences on house arrest puts communities at risk. For the last couple of minutes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to talk about the issues many community leaders talk to me about. In addition to doing everything they can to combat gun and gang crime, they spend many hours fighting those who traffic drugs in their communities and prey on the vulnerable who are struggling with mental health issues and addictions. Bill C-22 makes life far more difficult for local law enforcement and prosecutors by reducing and in some cases removing penalties for trafficking, importing, or producing Schedule 1 or 2 substances. Conservatives believe those struggling with addiction or mental health issues should get the help they need. They need treatment rather than prison time if their crime is not violent. Conservatives support restorative justice policies to lower incarceration rates for overrepresented groups in our criminal justice system, provided the public safety considerations are paramount. What is clear, Mr. Speaker, in Bill C-22 is that the government, driven by ideology and having no basis in the reality on the ground in rural Canada, is making our communities less safe by removing many important tools. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all members to take a long, hard look at this legislation before they vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member started off by talking about how the Prime Minister had made a comment that Conservatives were disconnected from Canadians. 54% of Conservatives don't believe in climate change, don't think that it's something that needs to be at the forefront of their agenda. The overwhelming vast majority of Canadians believe that we need to act on climate change. So I think it's quite clear why the Prime Minister may have made that comment, given some of the discussion that came out of this members' convention a few weeks ago. But to his point about reading out the victims' statements, and I'm really glad that he did that. I think that those were very meaningful words, and I thank him for that. But I guess the difference is that I believe that those victims' statements are best intended and best used for a judge and to make in a decision on how to cast judgment on somebody who breaks the law. Does he not agree that the best purpose of having those victim statements is to help the judge in determining what the sentence should be?
The honourable member for Desnathy, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his question. I would start my answer by simply suggesting we're talking today about Bill C-22, not about climate change. So let's stick to the topic. In the context of discretion of judges, judges are professional. They have great training. They have great abilities. But as a new member of Parliament, I clearly, and I say clearly, understand it to be part of my responsibility to make legislative decisions, to set laws, to set guidelines for judges and for the criminal justice system. I believe this is not a partisan issue. Many of the minimums being eliminated by the government were in fact introduced by previous Liberal governments. It is our job, in my understanding, Mr. Speaker, as legislators, as members of Parliament, to in fact have input onto these matters.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, let's talk about it. Let's talk about our role as legislators. I would invite all of my colleagues on either side to go and consult the organizations, including street workers. And I'm thinking of someone in Laurentides-Labelle whom we can understand the impact of crimes that can be committed by people who are suffering. So when I hear talk about crimes, what's wrong with trying to understand what these people have experienced in order to commit those crimes? And here we're talking about a change in approach, a change in knowledge. I would like to hear my colleague talk about how is it that he can be opposed to this bill.
Desnathy.
The Honourable Member for Desnathy, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for the question. And fundamentally, I don't disagree with her. As I deal with many of the people in northern Saskatchewan, I understand there are many underlying issues, and there are many issues that are foundational to the challenges faced in these communities. And for example, one of my chiefs begged me one day to help him teach the people of his community to be good parents. The children of his community are begging for parents. So there's many underlying issues that start well before we get to the commission of crimes. But in the commission of crimes, Mr. Speaker, these are not minor offenses. These are not minimum kinds of matters that we're talking about with this legislation. At the end of the day, I absolutely and 100% believe that our actions result in consequences, and those consequences have to act as a deterrent at the end of the day.
Time for a short question for the honourable member for Couch and Malahat Langford, 30 seconds or so, and that'll give us time for a 30-second response. The honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives, the problem with the Conservative approach to the justice system is that they assume every offence is exactly the same when there are always complicating individual factors. My question to my colleague is, in the criminal code, there exists already section 718.2, which allows a judge to increase a sentence depending on the severity of the case. Again, my question is, why do the Conservatives not have faith in our judges to dole out the appropriate punishment when the criminal code already has a section that allows them to do just that?
For Desnathy, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question, and I would provide a very simple answer like I started originally. It is the responsibility of us as members of Parliament, as legislators, to give guidelines. I believe that's one of the fundamental roles that we have. In my time as mayor of a small city, there were two things that I took very seriously. One was the management of the finances of my little city, and one was the safety of my citizens. Those two were paramount. As a member of parliament, I believe the safety of my citizens, of my riding, of this country are paramount, and I believe it's our job as members of parliament to set the guidelines, to establish the rules, to establish the laws to which those guidelines must submit.
Resuming debate. The